Welcome to Asian Book Club, where we highlight Asian and Asian American authors. We are your hosts,
Jamae and Sabangan.
And I'm Stephen Park, and you've been staying pretty busy, Jamae.
I have. So, if y'all remember in the first episode where we talk about the reason why we started Asian Book Club, one of those reasons was because I had a hard time finding a book club where I can join, where I can find other women and femmes of color, where I felt welcome. And since then, I have found myself in 4 different book clubs.
Mm-hmm.
One of the book clubs is the one I said I had trouble getting into. I found another newly established book club of Filipinx, Filipina, Filipinos, and then another one online, as well as this Asian book club. So I went from 0 to 4.
Mm-hmm. And how have you been keeping up with them?
I've just been reading my butt off. Now I'm beginning to reestablish myself as a book dragon. So I'm reading all the things all at once.
Nice. All right, so this week we're going into our book Bodega, but before we get into it, I was thinking neither of us really grew up with a true bodega. I feel like a bodega is a very specific New York thing.
Yeah.
But obviously we grew up with other places that we went to, like liquor stores, and for me it was like a CVS or a Rite Aid, and these were like little places that I would stop by and pick up little snacks and things to eat on the side. Now, do you remember as a kid, if you were given $10, which was a pretty decent amount of money back then, what would you get? Like, where would you go and what would you get?
So, thinking about growing up, I would be given $5, and that felt like a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And there were 2 different stores that I can think of that was nearby. And one of them, I would always get these chocolate sticks in a juice. Oh my gosh, I don't know why I'm forgetting. I'm like blanking out on the names. But the juice was Zesto. I remember that for sure. I loved the orange and the grape Zesto the most.
Wait, what's a Zesto?
Zesto is like Filipino Capri Sun. But it's only fruit juice. So it's not whatever wild flavors Capri Sun comes in. So there would be grape, there would be orange, there would be, I don't remember what the green fruit was, but there was a green fruit.
I mean, is it fruit juice or quote-unquote fruit juice?
Of course it's quote-unquote fruit juice, but they were flavors that you can pinpoint. It wasn't like tropical blah, blah, blah.
And then what are these chocolate sticks?
I remember them being in a red box, and there would be 2 kids in the front with the chocolate sticks behind them. So I can't remember for the life of me what the name of the actual chocolate sticks are, but they're kind of like pre-dipped yan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the whole thing's chocolate, or do you have a little handle?
There's a little handle of non-dipped pretzel stick.
Nice.
Yeah, and that's what I would get whenever specifically my tatay, who is my paternal grandfather, whenever he would pick me up from school and he had $5 for me, that's where we would go.
For me, the thing that I remember or I look back on when I think about it is there was a Rite Aid exactly halfway between my junior high school and my home. And having both of my parents work, I always walked back.
Yes.
And so as I'm walking back, I always made a pit stop there. Not always, but if I had money, I'd make a pit stop there. It was also next to Little Caesars, which sometimes would also take that pit stop. But if I had the money and I was a kid, I was usually going for an Arnold Palmer, the big old can, and I think it was more for the value than anything else.
Totally.
And then I would get these pretzel things with the fake cheesy pizza thing on the inside.
Combos,
that's what it's called. That's what I would pick up. And I think if I had extra money, I'd go with like a little chocolate bar or something, but usually it was just those 2. It was the Arnold Palmer and the combos. Although I think sometimes I would spend all the money on a Rite Aid ice cream like gallon box, which it always came in a box like fancy wine. And you would just scoop and scoop. I I'm pretty sure that's the reason I got so heavy so quickly. But yeah, I would go to town on that. And I always felt like I had to eat it before my parents found out because they wouldn't let me have it. So I would try to finish a gallon of ice cream every single time.
And no one would find out.
I don't know. Like, my grandma, like, she's always home. So she might have known, but she was too loving to say anything.
So she never rat you out.
No, she would never do that.
No.
Yeah. Anyways, so those would be my go-tos. And I think if there was a bodega, it'd probably be worse because I'd probably get sandwiches and things. But yeah.
I'm just going to cut in. You did mention that we grew up going to liquor stores. I have never been to a liquor store until I went to Portland. I don't know how you grew up. I've never been to a liquor store on Guam.
A liquor store it's not a liquor store. It's like a 7-Eleven. It's like a convenience store.
Okay, gotcha.
But we call them liquor stores.
Maybe you call them liquor stores.
Yes, because California has the laws that you can purchase liquor from there, and a lot of people would.
Okay, thanks for clarifying, because my Guami mind was like, what? I did not grow up at a liquor store.
Yeah, kids were not allowed there. But speaking of which, we may not recommend you the next liquor to drink, but we can recommend you our recommendation for the week.
So, our recommendation for the week is someone who brings me in particular joy, and I think she brings us both joy. She is a comedian and an author. Her name is Ali Wong. She's known for writing the book Dear Girls, in which she talks specifically to her girls, but she also envelopes her readers into it. And she's also well known for being both a comedian and an actor. On Netflix, she has a whole slew of
stand-up specials.
Yeah, specials and series and a movie. You might know her from Beef, a drama series. You might know her from Always Be My Maybe, where she acts with Keanu Reeves and Randall Park, which is a rom-com. And the reason why I'm recommending Ali Wong is particularly for her comedy specials, Baby Cobra, Hard Knock Wife, and Don Wong. Whenever I feel down or whenever I feel lost and misguided and with no direction, these are the three specials that I automatically put on the television. They ground me, they bring me life, they bring me joy. And Ali Wong, find her at her website at aliwong.com or on Instagram at Ali Wong.
And 2023, she is currently on tour. So not saying that you may catch this time around, but you can find her tour dates and tickets at aliwong.com, and she is pretty active on her IG.
Yes.
But one thing I did want to input is there is a B-side to this, which is she was a producer, I think, but she also, I'm not sure exactly what her role was, but she had a major hand in the production of another stand-up special. His name was Shen Wang. Sheng Wang. A really, really, really surprisingly good stand-up comic.
Yes.
I would highly recommend adding that onto the list because I think they have very similar styles.
Yeah.
And so if you start listening to Ali Wong, you run out of content, then following that up with something that she put her hand into was also pretty good.
Yeah.
But that's our recommendation for the week. Okay, so this week we are talking about Bodega. This is our chapbook. Chapbook.
Yes, because it's a small collection of poems.
And Bodega was written by Su Hwang. And so let me just kind of review the description from the story graph. It is, against the backdrop of the war on drugs and the 1992 LA riots, a Korean girl comes of age in her parents' bodega in the Queensbridge projects, offering a singular perspective on our nation of immigrants and the tensions pulsing in the margins where they live and work. Now, once again, I am not the most apt or skilled at reading poetry, but how did you feel with the description that was provided by Storygraph?
Totally. So, on the opposite end, I am a poet myself and I love poetry. And reading it at the beginning, not thinking about the context of the LA riots, the war on drugs, and the immigrant family that the speaker comes from, it didn't feel like there was a through line or a thread that put things into focus. It felt like a lot of vignettes of New York. At least that's what I was reading, and it didn't feel as heavy as I was expecting it to be at first. What were your thoughts when you went into it?
So I think I originally went into it thinking that there would be a lot more effect from the war on drugs and the LA riots. Like, I thought that would be a much bigger character in these poems, but I realized it was just her story. Like, I think what they were talking about with those two big events in time were just setting up this environment of where she grew up in. So it was kind of like the backdrop. Like, it was like if you're looking at a photo of someone, the character was her, but the background were these events. So I went into it thinking same thing. I thought it would be a lot bigger on the context of those two events, but truly it was just about this girl at the time kind of growing up in New York.
Totally. And I think Storygraph's description highlights the active word here, backdrop. The war on drugs and the LA riots were a backdrop to the experience. And like you said, it wasn't the experience itself. Yeah. And before we continue, just as a reminder for those who are not particularly familiar with poetry, and I've shared this with Stephen in particular, but when we read poetry, even if it's autobiographical, we read poems through the eyes of the speaker. So we're not thinking of the author as a speaker, we're thinking of the speaker like a narrator as of some sort. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'll likely get it wrong.
It's
if
okay.
You as the listener also gets it wrong, then we just shake it off and keep moving forward.
Absolutely.
And just realize that it's a speaker, not the author.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, knowing what the backdrop is, knowing the context, I was able to better frame the collection and better understand where the speaker was coming from. And what brought more clarity was the structure. Bodega is broken down into 3 specific parts, and to me, those parts are not clearly outlined or titled. Instead, they're prefaced by another author's poem. And with that in mind, the 3 parts to me seem like part 1 was backstory, family life before the LA riots. Part 2 felt like the reach and the effects of the LA riots and the war on drugs from coast to coast. And part 3 seemed to be a back to new normal, which meant that there was still shape-shifting and assimilating, there was still trying to figure out parental relationships, and there was still dealing with a flawed world and country.
So let's talk about part 1. So this is her backstory, this is her growing up. What did you take away from this compilation of poems in part 1?
In this particular compilation, it seemed like the speaker had a lot of trouble growing up within their immigrant family, that there was a lot of fighting, that there was not only fighting between the parents, but among the family members, but there was still love. That's the general sense I got. But in addition, it felt like there was something brewing below the surface, that even though the people of different cultures and different backgrounds were getting along, that there was something going to happen, or something that the speaker foresaw happening.
Right. So we have decided to highlight a poem from each section of the 3 parts. And the first one that we wanted to talk about was Latchkey.
And you can find that on page 12.
Right. So Latchkey was a poem that I thought connected with me a lot because it was very familiar to how I grew up. My parents were always working because they were trying to make a living for my brother and I to succeed.
Yeah.
But my grandmother, even though she was home, she was a figure that took care of us. But past the moment that we were children, she didn't play a heavy hand in raising us. She was just there as a resource of what we needed. So we always felt like latchkey kids. So I'm going to read this poem for you. So latchkeys. When headlights cast shadow, puppets against the living room wall, my brother and I did our best to keep up appearances. He scurried to turn off the Nintendo console while I hung up on my best friend. He splayed open his biology textbook. I leapt to the upright Yamaha to play the first few notes of For Elise, a perfectly choreographed intermezzo for our parents who'd stagger in from their hour-long commute, their clothes reeking of chemicals. They'd nod, father heading to the backyard to hit a golf ball on a string, while mother silently made dinner, rice, kimchi, spam, as we three listened from different corners of the house to a tiny white ball greeting iron.
What images or what words jumped out at you when you were reading that poem?
The first one was brother. So my brother is and was and I think always will be such a big prominent figure in my life. He really helped guide me to the person that I've become now. And then the second one was Nintendo, because my brother and I always fought over the Nintendo. But those two words together raised a lot of what we were in our childhood. And I think it showed a very clear image of these kids being able to be with each other and not only survive, but find ways to both finish their homework, then still like do the fun parts of life, but then also complete the extra assignments of playing the piano and things like that. Then towards the back end, it was the mother cooking, which is the way that my mom shows our family love, is she's always cooking and making things for us.
Totally.
And then it was the dad, where my dad never golfed, but from an early age, I remember he'd come back from work and, you know, I think I understand it more now, but he needed some alone time. He needed to work out, or as he got older, he needed to take naps. But yeah, it just played, even though the activities may have not been exactly the same as what I grew up with, it was a very similar framework, and I think it really gave me a clear understanding of how she grew up as well.
Totally. Like a very familiar sense of things and having that relatability. Totally. It also, what stuck out to me in Latchkeys was how vivid the images were. How once the headlights brought shadows into the room, that was their cue to, we gotta hide what we were doing because our parents are not going to like it. And we're going to do the things that our parents enjoy or want us to be doing, like playing for Elise or playing the piano. And then allowing them to decompress while we're still miming the things that they expect us to do.
And kids won't know this nowadays, but my alarm was the garage door because it made such a loud noise rising up. But the way that my dad always caught me, and I think my brother too, but I always got caught watching the TV, because there's a certain thing that tube TVs used to do where they got really warm, but not only that, the TV screen wouldn't go straight black. It'd go to like a gray, and then it turned black. So my dad always knew, and I was like, how did he do that? Like, how on earth would he know? And I was like, is grandma snitching on me? I was like, I'm pretty sure she's not. But as I grew up, I kind of knew. But
totally.
Yeah. And then, so I thought this was a very bright and light way to look at things, even though obviously the parents are doing their own things. But as you progress in this part one, it gets a little bit darker. Yeah,
it does. There are different poems that are not necessarily focused on their family, like Hopscotch, where the speaker is talking about playing with their friends and how they're all from different backgrounds and not really thinking about it. And there's also a poem at the very end of this part one called Show Me Where It Hurts, where it acknowledges that this country, the US in particular, makes life difficult for people of color, especially those who are most marginalized, like women and femmes and girls of color.
And I thought that was a great look at some of the more global aspects of it, which does play more into that background of the struggle that we're seeing in America. On page 17, the poem about Omma, so Eomma, it's Omma, which is mom in Korean. That one shows that more internal struggle of what that family structure kind of had to go through as both parents are struggling in a new country without money and trying to raise kids and doing all those things. So I really liked how she looked at both the image of self, the intermediate environment, and then the larger environment.
Yeah, totally. Which brings us to part 2, where the racial tensions have bled across coasts and what those effects look like in the most immediate sense.
Because, when I think LA riots, I'm not thinking New York.
Right.
And like I said, I didn't know how it affected me, which is kind of the same sense I got from the book. Is it didn't seem like she really knew, like, oh, the LA riots
is happening.
Oh yeah, this is event, this Rodney King and that whole mess.
Right.
But yeah, it was very interesting to see her side of the story without telling the event.
Right, exactly. So it's showing, not telling. For those writers who know that writing rule, this was an absolute example of showing us what was happening without telling us what was happening. One of the poems that stuck out is the namesake of this book, Bodega, which spans from pages 44 to 50. And it begins with Adrienne Rich's words. But we have different voices, even in sleep, and our bodies so alike are yet so different, and the past echoing through our bloodstreams is freighted with different language, different meanings, though in any chronicle of the world we share, it could be written with new meaning. Part 1. Mrs. Kim sits on a stool behind the register. She spits gently on her fingers, bending back the wad of new dollar bills. She wears a latex glove, counting along the corners, nice and steady, like the hands of an expert surgeon, archer, manicurist? His name's Raul. When the Kims holler for him, it sounds something like Laol. Asians can't seem to roll their R's. Raul stocks shelves, mops the floor, breaks down cardboard boxes. The Kims talk to him by pointing to things. To Raul, they're squawking gulls. Por favor, por favor. He insists the regulars call him Jimmy. Some people prefer Jim, so to them he's Jim Kim. He doesn't look like a Jimmy, a James maybe. His real name is Kim Jin-soo, but that's not the sound of integration. He roams the aisles with his arms folded along his lower back, a real ajasi. Or he leans akimbo by the fruit stand along the curb, watching the city zoom by. When Jimmy smokes, he squats like an old woman in the fields or a peasant relieving himself in the woods. Where Raul comes from, there are tumbleweeds and an insistent heat. His wife and 3 children also remain. Here, in the land of bounty, he should never have to be hungry again. But his stomach feels empty. So many mouths need feeding. It's been 6 years since he's held his family. He tries not to think of them as he straightens cans of beans, tuna, tomato sauce to face the same way. Jim Kim daydreams by practicing his golf swing, his one source of happiness, a real Korean pastime. Putt-putt, an imaginary ball on pristine turf. When he plays twice a year at the community golf course, he channels Chick Nicholas in that hideous green jacket. Mrs. Kim watches Korean soap operas on a miniature TV next to the lotto machine, the one time of day she treasures. Latex fingers tap the counter like a metronome. In a past life, she wanted to be a concert pianist. To beat the doldrums, she hums the scales, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, though she can hardly remember herself as a little girl. After his 8-hour shift, Raul naps on the subway to Midtown. He moonlights as a dishwasher for a chichi French restaurant, Mon Amour. 2 Michelin stars. Back of the house, family meal is usually stew from leftover fish parts, head, tail, bones. On a decent night, spaghetti with mystery meat sauced out of a vat. Has no idea what foie gras is, what charcuterie is. A nice bottle of wine could feed his village for a week. He sleeps in a basement room with 4 other men. Raul takes out more trash. Never mind, he once farmed his own land. In Korea, Jimmy was a journalist, even traveled to Sydney. He has a picture to prove it. standing in front of the Leaf to Opera House by the harbor. But what does that matter now when he can't even string a full sentence together? What is the point of language when it's no longer yours? Put put. Part 2. A black man walks in, vanishes into an aisle. Mrs. Kim shoots up straight, stilled. She couldn't tell you why she's suspicious, full of dread. No real memory of fear, just imagined scenes propagated by who knows who or what. The man cradles a loaf of bread, loves diapers, a carton of milk. He smiles, but all she can do is glare. Sandy is in her one proper dress, the bright blue one that makes her eyes pop. She can't believe people donate perfectly fine clothes to Goodwill. Luckily, it was buried in the $3.99 bin. You snooze, you lose. She's afraid the Chinese lady can hear her stomach growl as she drops cans of tuna into her backpack, set on the floor. Sandy peers over the shelf, sees the lady watching a black guy opening the refrigerator door. No one ever suspects the young blonde girl who cleans up real nice. Suckers. Joseph is watched. Eyes constantly study his design, jerks and strata of skin and limbs. He lives around the corner, takes care of his daughter, was raised by a single mother, works nights as a security guard, volunteers at the Boys and Girls Club, sings in a church choir. But without the uniform, he knows he is as good as a dead man walking. Sandy walks up to the Chinese lady at the register, then runs her fingers along the packs of chewing gum like strings on her boyfriend's guitar. She can hear herself saying ching chong to that new girl in the elementary school years ago, every now and then. She picks the juicy fruit, throws a ripped dollar on the counter for the food weighing her down like a sack of stones, almost in the clear, if stealing could be this easy everywhere. Joseph stands behind the white girl, nervously tapping the counter. He knows an addict when he sees one. Can't help but notice a bruise at the back of her neck, ochre and green, stamps of a chokehold. A man should never lay his hand on a woman. Part 3. Mrs. Kim hands back change to the white girl in the nice dress. She wishes her husband would come back inside instead of staring into space. He could help keep an eye on the black man looking at the blonde girl. She sees Raul mopping the floor. Raul, she barks. Come here, por favor.
Alright, so looking into that story, I think there's a lot.
Yes, there are many layers.
Mm-hmm. So I think the cool thing is she puts 3 different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
We have the wife, Mrs. Kim. We have a little bit of glimpse into Raul.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have
So there are 4 perspectives then. Mm-hmm. Mrs. Kim, mm-hmm. Raul, who's helping at the bodega. Mm-hmm. There's the black man, Joseph, mm-hmm. and then there's the white girl, right. Sandy.
So I thought the black man had very small amount of role throughout the whole thing. Mm-hmm. I thought his character was more Mrs. Kim's focus on him, while Sandy is the one that we see a little bit more of. So definitely, that's why I originally was thinking 3, but yeah, 4.
Absolutely. It shows the systemic issues at play and how those many layers, for example, Mrs. Kim feels very uneasy around Joseph, but when she's not looking, Sandy is kind of robbing her blind.
Mm-hmm. Which, like, systemic is the word, because they moved here from Korea. Mm-hmm. They don't really know what's going on.
Right.
But with portrayals in movie, with things that they hear on the neighborhoods, like, there's only one way to create a bad character in your mind, and you don't do that on your own. Mm-hmm. I think it's something that's pretty strong within first-generation Asian cultures, like with our parents, is, I think, generally that's what I heard a lot of, is kind of fear and concern with black people, and that was heightened during the LA riots. She further goes on to highlight this in Sestina of Koreatown Burning.
Yes, pages 52 to 53.
Where it's a much closer look into the effect of the LA riots. Mm-hmm. And one of the lines she uses kind of towards the end is she's describing this chaos of events. Mm-hmm. And she says, "Fearing for our lives, my parents closed up shop, grounding themselves to threats that could shatter. Unaware, our black neighbors stood against our store entrance to prevent glass from breaking, a chain of fists to shatter. Not all black and Korean lives were against each other, grounded amid webbed glass." Mm-hmm. it's a strong image only because of what happened at that time.
Yeah.
With the ensuing chaos being both in neighborhoods that were predominantly black, but also chained into areas that had a high population of Korean people. There, I think I said this in the last episode, there were Korean people standing on top of their stores, protecting their stores with guns, and there were Korean people that shot black people. So I thought it was a really cool image, and I don't know, it's very systemic in how we view this,
Right.
with absolutely no validity or truth.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, colorism and anti-blackness can be found on multiple levels in multiple countries. Like, I do remember growing up and hearing relatives and family members say, you should stay away from these kinds of people. And by these kinds of people, they're either darker skin or black, or they look different from us as Filipinos and Filipinx. But in the same breath, living with people from different cultures and backgrounds and not having this same fight. And it could be different because we're on Guam, we're a territory, and the echoes of the LA riots we heard of, but it did not bleed into our everyday lives.
Yeah, I mean, but the LA riots were just a piece of it. Like, the structure was already well built. This was just like a little ornament that's being placed on top of it.
Right.
Like, the structure of racism was built for centuries.
Totally.
And so what we've learned, if we only listen to history in school the way that it's been taught when we were growing up,
Right.
it's really hard to see the other side and truly become an anti-racist against the hate and negativism towards black people. It's, I think, what we've done more recently as younger generations we started looking at the bigger structure of it, and I think that's why we can now come to the conclusions of understanding how racist things really were.
Right.
But yeah, no, I think the LA riots were just a tip of the iceberg.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
the stuff that you had heard when you were growing up was stuff that was already implanted for so long.
Totally. Definitely. And it also shows up differently in different communities.
Right, exactly.
Totally.
There are several really great poems within this. One of the other ones that I think you wanted to highlight was The Price of Rice.
Yes, it should definitely be one to read and to watch out for if you do pick up Bodega, because it's not only a tableau of an immigrant mother and her relationship with her child, it also talks about the war in Korea and how this civil war was brought on because of people from outside the country, and it tore and has still kept this country torn apart years and years later, and now it's at a standstill. Yet this mother who comes from this war-torn country is trying to impart love in this small way to her child.
Right. And not to mention, they teach the Korean way of cooking rice.
Yes.
Which we've talked about before. But this is putting the hand in.
Yes.
Water comes up to the knuckles.
Yes.
And the wrist. But my hands are too fat, so it comes up to the knuckles. Yeah, so I mean, that kind of takes us through part 2.
And into part 3.
Right.
And here again, we are seeing the after effects and how even though things have maybe quieted down, there's still the assimilation and this need to survive in a flawed world.
Right. And so let's start off with the first poem from this section.
It's called Face Off, and this can be found on pages 67 and 68. After a few nomadic years, we settled into a split-level house nestled in a cul-de-sac, away from bustling boroughs, but never far from raids of sprawling estates and train tracks that cleaved privilege and affluence from our constant state of deprivation. A latchkey kid, I often stole away to the basement, chock full of vinyl bags of worn clothes and boxed skyscrapers, reeking mothballs. My mother, an expert magpie of things already discarded. built-in bar next to the boiler, deserted and unused, became Barbie's mansion. Multi-storied cross-sections of elaborate chambers rivaling any store-bought imitations. Unlike my classmates' dolls, who had entire Mattel playrooms filled with glittery toys and miniature Pepto-Pink Corvettes, my Barbie only owned one other casual outfit. So I made sure Ken engaged in easy conversation, half lying on a couch made from fabric swatches, mimicking what I saw on The Young and the Restless. In the throat of this hidden cave, I inhabited whiteness without retribution. No longer Ching Chong China girl, I, a ravishing blonde trophy with perfect proportions. Pipe dream. I wondered what it would be like to strip away slit eyes. Sick of assimilation, the debilitating task of tireless reinvention. Then came the right solution. Press curling iron to sculpt a familiar countenance. Black magic marker graffitied over golden tresses. In horrific absolution, I beheld plastic melting into a gooey mess. Oh, the glorious stink of burning rubber. Without pomp or ballyhoo, I buried her in the backyard by a stand of evergreens, Ken thrown in for good measure, a pine cone in lieu of a headstone to lie in peace. Forever. I almost laughed out loud when I read this poem. Not only was it familiar in that in this poem, the speaker's mother is the one who keeps all the things, but in my household, my dad kept all the things, and we had boxes upon boxes of things stored in storage, and I'm putting air quotes here, and storage meant any available closet.
You had?
Have. It's still current, but we've been able to slowly chip away at it. Doesn't mean that it's gone, but there are still skyscrapers of boxes. So that imagery, the imagery of playing with Barbie and knowing that she didn't look like me, but still playing with her nonetheless. And then how she said that she was essentially, the speaker was essentially trying to make Barbie look more like her, painting Barbie's hair black and trying to use the curling iron to fix it and essentially burning the Barbie. I didn't have any access to curling irons, but I did have access to scissors, and Barbie's hair was too long because her hair did not mimic mine, and I thought in my little girl brain that my hair grows, so Barbie's hair is gonna grow. So, just like I did to my hair, I cut my own hair when I was 5. I cut Barbie's hair, and it was a mess. It was a wild, wild, wild mess. So I totally related to the speaker in that I also tried to make Barbie look like me in order to feel, I guess, pretty or to feel more seen, because at that time there weren't Asian Barbies. There was definitely not a Filipinx Barbie.
Right. Like Ed Lim told us.
Yes, exactly. Like Ed Lim said, he looked everywhere and they were nowhere, and the one that showed up late in life was too expensive for anyone to purchase.
The Gospel of Ed Lim.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really good. This poem kind of kept on theme for me of poetry that highlighted her life events, but spoke in certain ways to the things that I grew up with. Once again, me and her, looking at the stories, we didn't share a whole lot of the sameness, but we shared a whole lot of similarities.
Yes.
And I thought that was something that I could grasp onto with a lot of her writing.
Totally. And other poems that showed the after effects or the aftermath were Han on pages 83 to 84, in which the speaker it's kind of like a parallel, a mirror of sorts from part 1, where in part 1 her parents were arguing with each other and having these fights, and then in part 3 the speaker hears an argument in the other room, but this time it's not her parents arguing, but they're watching a drama together of some characters arguing instead. And another poem that I think everyone should read if you do pick up this book is Masters of Reinvention on page 75, where it highlights how the speaker feels that they need to act in a certain way and chameleon themselves based on the situation, and not being able to be pinned down by anyone for survival's sake. And finally, one other poem that kind of wraps it up, or that kind of stuck out to me, was Sarangheo on page 85. And I'm going to read the particular lines that kind of spoke out to me. And Steven, can you explain what Sarangheo means?
사랑해요 means I love you.
And on page 85, the last two lines say, "Sometimes love is tying a knot in your throat, then taking it to the grave. Sometimes it's hoping against hope that a seed will flower into fable long after we are gone." So it's not only planting a seed for now and hoping that the love will prosper or fruit now, but even if nothing shows up in the present, hopefully generations later something else will bloom from this.
Also a very tricky way to make someone say I love you to you. Like Jamae, what is mahal kita?
It means I love you.
Wow. Yeah, so how is this similar or different to other poems or poetry collections you've read in the past?
So for me, what I find very interesting but also refreshing is that Su Hwang uses spatial and structural variety even within the poems themselves. So some poems, they're specific structures like sonnets and sestinas, but there are other poems where there's bigger spacing, less spacing, words that are scrunched up together and words that are broken up. So having those different structures and spatial and visual elements in one collection, especially in a small chapbook, it makes me feel validated, because I used to do this with my poems, and my English teacher in 9th grade, if you're listening to this, you were wrong and I was right. You should be sorry.
I don't think there's one wrong or right way to do things. So.
Which is why I don't understand why I got a B.
Well. Anyways, moving on from your past trauma. How has this collection of poems changed the way you think about the genre?
I mean, for poems, it really didn't change the way I think about the genre. It made me appreciate poetry even more. Again, because I feel validated, but also because rather than focusing on the events, it was more about the experience itself and what was happening during these events. What about for you? Has this collection changed your mind?
If I were to be absolutely honest, reading a poetry book like this, I think I understood maybe 50% of it.
Which is valid.
Yeah, maybe like even 40. Like it was the poems that stuck with me, I think connected with me very well. But a lot of the other ones were just words that I was reading through. So it was a story in passing rather than something that I could keep with me. I think some of it just kind of seems over the top for me, like in terms of, not over the top, but it's flying over my head.
I see.
So yeah, I don't know. I don't think I understand poetry very much. So I don't understand the nuances. Like I don't know why the words are shaped like this versus like this versus justified versus looking like a painting.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's different. It's something I'm not completely opposed to, but I think reading through a whole book, I'm definitely not going to be able to connect with every single one.
Totally.
Nor would I be able to partition out the different genres or the different categories that the speaker is trying to give the reader or the listener.
Absolutely. And as a reminder for everyone, both poets, non-poets, readers, non-readers, when we read poetry, usually we should give ourselves space to read it slowly and multiple times so that you can give yourself time to marinate and process. Because definitely reading through it once, even for myself, even as an avid poem lover, There are some poems where I'm able to read it once and kind of get a sense, and there are some poems where I have to read it again and again and again to fully flesh out what I think the meaning is. So that's one. Give yourself time when you're reading poetry. So if you read along with us and you feel like your brain is spinning, totally give yourself space, walk away, and then come back to it again later. And two, just because this was my interpretation of the poems doesn't mean that that interpretation is right. Sometimes we get the interpretation that the writer or the author was trying to give to us, and sometimes we as human beings with prior knowledge and past experiences see and pick out different things and put more meaning into those things than the author meant. So all that to say, the interpretation is in the eye of the beholder. So you take from it what you can and what you will based on the context that's given to you. So those are Jamae's 2 quick tips on reading poetry.
So would you recommend this book?
Absolutely, yes. I would recommend this book because there's so much to gain from it. Like we were talking about, there are so many familiar scenes and vignettes and tableaus, but there's also different global and national things that we can gain from it too. Would you recommend it?
Pass. I don't know. I think I stand to the side. I would say if you're interested in this, then read it. But for me, I don't think this makes me want to go pick up another poetry book right away. Because it's just, I think I'm much more, I like the stories. And yeah.
I'm going to tack on, is there someone who comes to mind when you're reading this book that you would share it with?
I think originally, so the preface in this book is Su Hwang writes it in English, but she has it translated to Korean. And reading the preface, I originally thought of my mom. But I think the stories seem to be written for a younger generation of people that can connect with her. So I think people around our age, so in their 30s, early 40s, late 20s, somewhere in that range, I think are the people that seemingly might connect with these stories the most.
So millennials and Gen Zers.
Yeah.
Totally.
All right. So that ends our analyzation of Bodega. And then we are now going to move on to our next book, which, to help you along and figure out what that next book is, we're going to give you our hint of jam.
So we have 3 hints for our next book club pick. First, the author is a vegetarian who was working as a textbook editor when she started taking a class in memoir writing. Hint number 2, this memoir is a collection of essays. And hint number 3, it's both a celebration and a conflict all at once.
Yeah, and so those are your 3 hints, the hint of jam. All right, so you stuck around with us for quite a while.
Yes.
If you have any questions, comments, or anything like that, how can they reach out to us?
You can find us on Instagram at Asian Book Club Pod, P-O-D, and through email at asianbookclubpod, P-O-D, @gmail.com.
Yeah, and we also encourage you, now that we're kind of further into these series, we encourage you to kind of chat with other people that might be in the Instagram family and just leave comments and thoughts that you might have on the sections that we've read or anything like that. So that way you can kind of join in on the community of Asian Book Club folks.
Yes.
Yeah. You can also find us at asianbookclubpod.com, where we have our bookshop where you can find our recommendations and books that we've read so far. Buy a book on there. It helps support us a little bit.
Yes.
And don't forget to subscribe. do all the things that you do for other podcasts.
Review, subscribe, rate.
Yeah. And if we've learned one thing through all this, it's to leave poetry to the pros.
Well,
Bye.
bye.